I have some slides, so I'm gonna share my screen and in a moment, and I will also be sharing a source sheet with the story that I'll be talking about today. There we go. Yeah, and just so you know, the source sheet that we're sharing, everything on the source sheet, I will also be sharing through my slides. It's just if you want to spend more time with the text or look at them later. So first, let me say what a pleasure it is to be with you. It's very meaningful to me to be able to revisit the Me Too movement, a movement that continues to have international reach on the very week during which we celebrate International Women's Day. And it is also particularly apt, as Tadeusz said, that we are talking about these issues also on the eve of the Fast of Esther. The story of Queen Esther and the story of Vashti, her predecessor in King Ahasuerus's court, reminds me both of how old and persistent the problem of gender-based domination is, and also holds out a model of the powerful transformations that are possible when women speak out. And in my view, that's what the Me Too movement is all about. So my focus today is not on the biblical story of Purim, but rather on a story from the Babylonian Talmud that I and others turned to both elevate the claims of the Me Too movement and to ground the values of accountability and dignity and safety that the Me Too movement was advancing in traditional Jewish ethics. So before I get started, it's important to note that this topic of gender-based harassment and sexual abuse that we're talking about whenever we're talking about the Me Too movement hits close to home for many people. So I just want to invite you to take care of yourself and take a break if the discussion is difficult for you. Let me also share a word with respect to language. Some people who suffer the harms of sexual harassment or assault or abuse identify as victims, use the language of victims to talk about themselves, and others prefer the language of survivor. So during this talk, I will sometimes use one, sometimes the other, and sometimes both. Yeah, so as I mentioned, my focus today is on an extended Talmudic narrative from the Babylonian Talmud, tractate Moed Katan, page 17a, that I and others gravitated to in the first flush of the 2017 Me Too movement. My initial excitement about this text was actually something of a departure for me. I am trained in critical approaches to the study of the Babylonian Talmud, and this means that I seek to understand rabbinic literature within the historical context of the late antique societies in which it took shape. I generally come to the text that I study with low expectations for how its content can address specific ethical issues in contemporary life, especially when it comes to issues of gender. So this is a departure for me, but in 2017, when the hashtag #MeToo went viral and victims and survivors of sexual misconduct and abuse began telling their stories and began demanding justice, I and others looked to this Talmudic narrative as a text that could not only support the victims' ethical claims, but also give these claims the imprimatur of Talmudic authority. Upon further study and in dialogue with colleagues, I revised my initial reading of the Talmudic narrative and came to a different understanding of what the text means and how it addresses questions of justice and accountability. So today I will be sharing the story of how I changed my mind about this Talmudic story. I'll begin this talk with some general comments about Me Too and Jewish speech ethics, and then I'll spend the bulk of our time taking you through the Talmudic story, opening up two alternative interpretations that speak to power abuses and accountability in very different ways. And I'll close with some brief reflections on what this exercise in bringing the Talmud into conversation with today's contemporary issues and struggles suggests about what the Talmud offers and doesn't offer contemporary Jewish ethics. And then I'll welcome your questions and thoughts. So the Me Too movement was first founded in 2006 by activist Tarana Burke as a movement to help survivors of sexual violence, especially women and girls from marginalized communities, find healing and support. Burke was then working at a youth summer camp, and she reports that the phrase "Me Too" came to her as she reflected on how best to support a girl at the camp who had been herself a victim of sexual violence and who disclosed what had happened to her to Tarana Burke. At the time, Burke did not share her own story with the girl, and it later occurred to her that had she said, "Me too," it would have helped puncture the sense of isolation that afflicts so many victims and survivors. For Burke, "Me too" was not so much a rallying cry as a consolation, a confidence, an invitation for survivors to find mutual support. She said of the phrase, "It's a very touchy, private, deeply personal thing." Me Too then went viral as a hashtag in fall of 2017 when film actress Alyssa Milano used it in a tweet in response to revelations of Harvey Weinstein's crimes. Once the hashtag was embraced by Hollywood, the meaning of Me Too shifted. While Burke's primary focus was on sexual violence perpetrated against poor girls and women of color, the hashtag was invoked in connection to a wide array of sexual misdeeds in diverse corners of American life, but particularly in the halls of power, in politics, the arts, the media, and large corporations. What had been an invitation to relationship, a private, deeply personal thing, became overtly and emphatically public, a call to expose the misconduct of the powerful and to hold them accountable for their misdeeds. This shift from intimate speech to public speech is powerfully captured by the translation that Me Too underwent in France. And you'll have to excuse my French for this international audience, but my understanding is that there it became balance ton porc, or squeal on your pig. So while Me Too are words with which one could privately, quietly receive a disclosure, squeal on your pig is a call to disclose, to call out, to name aloud and publicly. The Me Too movement traced a trajectory from silence to speech, from privacy to publicity. While some of the most egregious Me Too cases, the serial abuses of Harvey Weinstein, for example, were adjudicated in the courts, in most instances, the worst publicity, the worst consequences that those accused have suffered can be directly traced to the publicity that attended the accusations. You might remember there was a time several years ago when forced resignations and terminations were the stuff of the daily news as comedians and congressmen, news anchors, and media moguls were publicly exposed and spurned. In those heady days, the scandals that seized the headlines were matched by an outpouring of personal testimonies on social media. In my real life encounters as well, it seemed like a dam had broken, and stories of abuse and objectification flooded forth from friends, colleagues, and relatives, all disclosing secrets long buried. It felt like something was shifting in the culture. It felt like there would, at long last, be an accounting for gender-based abuses of power. At the time, I was struck by how the Me Too movement exemplified a phenomenon identified by social scientist James C. Scott. In his 1990 work, Domination and the Arts of Resistance, Hidden Transcripts, Scott describes the transformative power that is unleashed when stories of oppression that have long been kept under wraps are at long last made public. Scott's theory of hidden transcripts begins with the observation that oppressed people tend to have two distinct modes of discourse, one for addressing the powerful in public, and another for a confined circle of secret sharers. Most of the time, people do the best they can to get along with people who have power over them. And the more vulnerable one is, the more pressure one feels to assuage those who are powerful, outwardly affirming the official version of events. But quietly and covertly, among trusted friends and confidants, the powerless speak the truth about the oppression and offenses they suffer. These true stories of abuse and humiliation are what Scott calls hidden transcripts. They quietly circulate among oppressed people through complaints, gossip, and whisper networks, and are normally too risky to share in public. When a hidden transcript is at long last brought into the open, the very act of disclosure becomes a potent force for change. According to Scott, it is only when this hidden transcript is openly declared that subordinates can fully recognize the full extent to which their claims, their dreams, their anger is shared by other subordinates. Scott chronicles examples of how the act of publicly exposing hidden transcripts has sparked political movements and social uprisings, unseating the powerful. During the early months of the Me Too movement, Scott's theory seemed like an apt account of the social upheaval and cultural shifts that the hashtag had unleashed. So apt, it got me wondering why such disruptions were so slow in coming to the Jewish community. For all the stories of harassment and humiliation that I was hearing from friends and colleagues, for all the testimonies of assault and intimidation that were filling my Facebook feed, in Jewish communal circles, the shift that Me Too brought was not so much that hidden transcripts were now being spoken aloud, but rather that such stories were being shared at all, quietly, in anonymous posts or in hushed tones. I heard whispers that impugned major donors, rabbis, and other professional leaders of a range of improprieties and abuses. Yet, in contrast to the wider American public, within the American Jewish world, there were long months during which public accusations of misconduct remained few and far between. To a certain degree, the logic of the Me Too movement runs counter to traditional Jewish speech ethics, which on the whole favors discretion over disclosure and privacy over publicity. Though there's certainly a robust tradition around rebuke and protest in rabbinic writings, rabbinic circumspection about speech is much better known and more widely emphasized. In one oft-cited Talmudic passage, embarrassing someone in public is compared to bloodshed. The dangerous power of the tongue is emphasized in classical rabbinic discussions of lashon hara, or evil speech, and is reinforced in Jewish liturgy in the daily petition that God guard my tongue from evil, and also in the prominence of speech acts in the long confessional lists of sins that are recited during the season of atonement. And I want to offer one further illustration of rabbinic circumspection with regard to speech by highlighting how an ancient tradition of speaking truth to power changed when it shifted from Greek culture into Jewish culture. The concept of parrhesia traces back to ancient Greece. Michel Foucault offered a series of lectures on the topic in 1983, and this book is based on those lectures. Parrhesia is courageous speech that is addressed to a king in defense of the public good. By definition, a king cannot engage in parrhesia because the king has the power to ensure his own safety. But neither is parrhesia something that every subordinate is empowered to practice. It is rather a right or privilege of those who are free to engage in civic life. So Foucault encapsulated the meaning of the ancient concept like this. He wrote, in parrhesia, the speaker uses his freedom and chooses frankness instead of persuasion, truth instead of falsehood or silence, the risk of death instead of life and security, criticism instead of flattery, and moral duty instead of self-interest and moral apathy. But as Jewish studies scholar Julia Watts-Belzer has noted, when the Greek word parrhesia enters the rabbinic lexicon, it undergoes a shift. In the Talmud, and we'll see this in a minute when we turn to our text, parrhesia simply means in public. It is not a word that describes a speech act, but rather its setting. The opposite of parrhesia is in privacy or secrecy, and the Talmud develops different ethical norms to govern these two different realms. For the rabbis, a public setting magnifies the moral valence of any action, so that transgressions in public are far more grievous than those same acts would be if performed in privacy, in secret. By the same token, publicity is what allows ordinary acts of piety to become magnified into acts that sanctify the name of God. Rabbis venerate martyrs who risk their lives to testify to God's greatness in public. But in general, for the Talmud, the electric force of publicity serves to drive speech and action into the safety of private spaces. For all the changes that the word parhesia undergoes when it moves from Greek into Hebrew, what unites these two concepts is a sense of danger. While Greek drama and Greek philosophy celebrate the courage of those who face down tyrants and speak truth to power, the rabbis of the Talmud caution Jews about the communal costs of speaking or acting in public. While the Greek concept of parhesia aligns well with the Me Too movement's ethos of truth-telling in public, the classical rabbinic response to the threat of tyrannical powers has been to withdraw or retreat from public view. I am interested in how this Greek concept becomes transformed in rabbinic culture because it offers a powerful illustration of the cultural context for the development of Jewish speech ethics. While Greek culture could celebrate a figure like Socrates, a citizen of Athens who sacrificed his life in dogged commitment to the truth, the ancient rabbis occupied a much different position with regard to state power. Rabbis might pursue philosophical questions of individual virtue, just like Socrates did, but they also sought to define norms for a whole community for whom they felt accountable. Whatever authority rabbis were granted by the Roman or Sasanian rulers was always hemmed in by the Jews' collective vulnerability to imperial power. It is not surprising then that within this socio-political context, ancient rabbis balked at the prospect of telling tales out of school. It makes sense that given the precarity of Jewish status vis-a-vis imperial control, rabbis would seek to avoid the risk of imperial interventions by embracing an ethos of restraint. The cultural context of the ancient rabbis makes their valorization of keeping silent very understandable, but it also demonstrates how ill-suited this ethos might be in the contemporary context of liberal democracy. When Me Too first surged within public life, I worried that the traditional rabbinic emphasis on reticence and the well-known prohibition against public shaming were stalling or stopping the disclosure of hidden transcripts within the Jewish community. It was against this backdrop, It was within this backdrop that I followed the lead of other rabbis and scholars and turned to the Talmudic story we will examine together now, promoting it as a rabbinic precedent for Me Too, an exception to the more dominant rabbinic emphasis on keeping silent. Later, my reading got more complicated, as I will explain. But first, let's look at the beginning of the story. There was a certain rabbinical student whose reputation was despised. Rav Yehuda said, "What should be done? Should I excommunicate him? But the sages need him. Should I not excommunicate him? But this would be to desecrate the name of heaven." He said to Rabbi Bar Chana, "Have you heard anything with regard to this issue?" He said to him, Rabbi Yochanan said as follows, "What is the meaning of that which is written? For the priest's lips should keep knowledge, and they should seek Torah at his mouth, for he is a messenger of the Lord of hosts." This verse teaches, if the teacher is similar to a messenger of the Lord, then seek Torah from his mouth. But if he is not, then do not seek Torah from his mouth. Rav Yehuda excommunicated the student. In keeping with the style of Talmudic narrative, the language here is terse. What are we to make of this unnamed rabbinical student? What did he do to earn his bad reputation? We are not told, but later on, the storyteller will provide what I take as an important clue, reporting that this student died in a very particular way. And here I'm going to give you a spoiler, but we will soon learn that he dies from a bee sting to the penis. Since rabbinic storytelling generally presumes a sense of providence in which divine punishment fits the crime, this deadly bee sting is a strong indication that the student's offense was sexual. It is this detail about the rabbinic student's unusual death that led me and others to understand that the student's bad reputation came from whispered accusations of sexual misconduct. Rav Yehuda has heard the rumors and he takes them to heart, but he faces a dilemma. The student is doing valuable communal work, and so Rav Yehuda asks himself, what should be done? For me, it was the Talmud's account of Rav Yehuda's dilemma that first brought this story into such close alignment with the contemporary problem of harassment and abuse in the Jewish community. In Rav Yehuda's musings, I can hear the unspoken calculus that so often weighs moral claims and the allegations of victims against perceived institutional and communal needs. Some individuals are considered too important, too valuable to be held accountable, even when their deeds are open secrets and the ethical considerations are actually quite clear. On his own, from the first, Rav Yehuda recognizes that to allow this rabbinical student to remain in his post would be a desecration, and yet he nevertheless hesitates. Rabbi Bar Chana offers the moral clarity and religious authority that Rav Yehuda sought in his time and that I sought in mine. Rav Yehuda declares a shamta, a temporary ban of excommunication on the rabbinical student. In my initial reading, even as Rav Yehuda's initial indecision resonated with the reticence of contemporary Jews to act on reports of harassment and abuse, his enactment of the ban provided a model for how organizational leaders could overcome this hesitation. At the time, the popular press was full of accounts of he said, she said, a troubling shorthand that recasts accuser and accused as if they have parity, as if they meet on even ground. In fact, most abuses happen across a great divide of power, with accusers already bearing the initial harm and also bearing great risk in speaking out, while those who are accused can rally the resources of their institutions behind them. The American criminal justice system puts the burden of proof on accusers, and this presumption of innocence is widely assumed to prevail in workplaces and communal spaces as well. But as many activists point out, the high threshold of evidence required in a criminal court is not appropriate to other spheres of life, and certainly not when people's safety is in jeopardy. When victims, survivors come forward to report misconduct, only to have their reports ignored, minimized, or negated, and to have their credibility challenged, this not only harms the individual complainant, but sends a clear message that it is at best ineffectual and potentially dangerous to report wrongdoing. To my mind, at the time, the extrajuridical rabbinic institution of the Shamta provided a response to the so-called he said, she said problem that authorities so often invoked in discounting the reports of victims. It offered a precedent for privileging the safety and dignity of those who are harmed over the reputations of alleged perpetrators, and it drew attention to the difference between standards of a courtroom and communal norms of safety and respect. So in classical rabbinic jurisprudence, one needs the testimony of 2 eyewitnesses before a court can even consider imposing penalties. But an individual rabbi, or even any individual perhaps, can impose a shamta, or excommunication ban. In the surrounding Talmudic discussion, there are several different kinds of bans of varying terms of length and degrees of stringency, and all of them are strategies for addressing wrongdoing that cannot be addressed by a court. So here, it seemed to me, the Talmud's account of Rab Yehuda offered a powerful precedent for how community leaders could take action, separating dangerous leaders from settings in which they were accused of doing harm in a proactive pursuit of safety and dignity. In the early months of Me Too, I imagined Rab Yehuda as a hero who finds the wherewithal to end the silence that isolates victims, forcing a colleague to suffer the consequences of his hidden offenses in a very public way. I invoked his story to bolster my argument that survivors of sexual harassment and assault could find support for their moral claims within the Talmud. But once I began to delve deeper into the text, other interpretive possibilities began to emerge. Of course, we have not yet gotten to the end of the story. And before we return to the text and uncover other details that complicate my initial reading, I want to acknowledge that it is not only my interpretation of the story that changed. My analysis of events in our world began to shift as well. Or it did not take long before developments within and beyond the Jewish community demonstrated that, for better and for worse, the trajectory of Me Too revelations within the Jewish community was not as anomalous as I had initially thought. I will not now rehearse the large numbers of cases of misconduct that began to come to light beginning in the summer of 2018. Some allegations were sloughed off, dismissed with canned sorry, not sorry statements, but others instigated real shakeups and institutional change. Communal responses to sobering revelations of gross misconduct and institutional cover-ups in the Jewish community continue today. But back in 2018, even as Jewish leaders and scholars began to come forward to say Me Too, instigating change within the Jewish community, the larger Me Too movement faced a devastating setback. In September 2018, less than a year after the surge of the Me Too hashtag, the harrowing Senate testimony of Professor Christine Blasey Ford electrified the country, but did not impede the man she accused of sexual assault from being confirmed as a Supreme Court justice. For me, this was a sobering demonstration of the shortcomings of James Scott's theory of hidden transcripts. James Scott exalts the liberatory power of truth-telling in public, but had he considered the ways structural hierarchies buttress the power of institutions, making them all but impervious to victims' allegations. Institutions have their own reasons for managing, minimizing, and suppressing complaints, and often re-traumatize complainants with a secondary victimization in pursuing institutional interests. Events in the news and closer to home led me to wonder if the Me Too movement was equal to entrenched, moneyed political forces. With the countervailing forces of money, power, and structural hierarchies in mind, the story of Rab Yehuda reads differently. So, before we turn back to the continuation of the Talmudic text, let me invite you to consider an alternative interpretation of the part we have read so far, by invoking the insights of my colleague, Professor Sarah Lev. For Lev, the unnamed rabbinical student is not a perpetrator of sexual misconduct, but rather a victim of the institutional abuse of power. In support of this interpretation, Lev points out that the narrative provides no details about the foundation for the rabbinical student's bad reputation and gives no indication whatsoever of a victim or of an aggrieved party. Even granting that sting on the penis bespeaks a sexual sin, it is important to remember that within the cultural horizon of rabbinic life, any sexual activity outside of marriage would have been objectionable. Professor David Brodsky reads the student as queer. But whatever we might conjecture about the nature of the rabbinical student's offense, the content of his bad reputation, Professor Lev's point is that the student is not the worst offender in the story, but is himself a victim of power abuses. Whereas I had viewed Rav Yehuda's ban as a positive intervention in pursuit of safety and of justice, Lev sees it as symptomatic of rabbinic overreach. Opposing my and others' invocation of this story in solidarity with Me Too, Lev proposes that the text speaks more authentically to an atmosphere in which institutions sacrifice their more disposable person in order to protect the reputation of the institution and of their leadership. So with this alternative interpretation in mind, I want to return to the story. In the end, Rav Yehuda took ill. The sages came to inquire about his well-being, and he, the one who had been excommunicated, came together with them. When Rav Yehuda saw him, he laughed. He, the excommunicated student, said to him, "Was it not enough that you excommunicated me? You even laugh at me?" Rav Yehuda said to him, "I was not laughing at you. Rather, as I go to the next world, I am happy that I did not flatter even such a man as you." Rav Yehuda died. Here, for the first time, we hear the voice of the excommunicated student himself, as he decries the personal insult of being mocked by Rav Yehuda when he comes to see him on his sickbed. What are we to make of this encounter? I think the text could easily sustain my initial reading, in which the student is a offender who acts with impudence, shamelessly pressing his own case without regard for the ailing Rav Yehuda. But Sarah Lev's more sympathetic evaluation of the student is also plausible. For though the Talmud elsewhere classifies the Shamta as a temporary ban, with Rav Yehuda's death, it will become indefinite. In Lev's reading, the student comes with a sense of urgency to protest and reverse his mistreatment. As the story continues, the disgraced student continues to press his case, appealing to one authority after another. He, the excommunicated student, came to the sages in the Beit Midrash and said to them, "Release me." The rabbi said to him, "There is no man here as important as Rabbi Yehuda who could release you, but go before Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya so that he can release you." He went before him. He, Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, said to Rabbi Ami, "Go examine his case. If he ought to be released, release him." Rabbi Ami examined his case and decided to release him. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani stood up on his feet and said, "With regard to the maidservant of Rabbi's household, the sages did not make light of the excommunication she imposed for 3 years. With our colleague Yehuda, how much the more so?" Rabbi Zera said, "What does this mean that this aged man, Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani, who has not come to the Beit Midrash for how many years now appears? Conclude from this that he ought not be released." He was not released. He left crying. A bee came and stung him on his member, and he died. They brought him to the burial cave of the righteous, and he was not accepted. They brought him to the cave of the judges, and he was accepted. In this section, the rabbis close ranks, and the structures of power become ever more prominent. First, Rav Yehuda's colleagues inform the student that they don't possess sufficient authority to overturn his ban. He will have to go to the land of Israel and appeal to Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, heir of the line of the patriarchate. Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya deputizes Rabbi Ami to investigate. Rabbi Ami's inquiries lead him to move to release the student, but when he suggests as much, the elderly Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani rises to object that such a reversal would be an affront to the memory of Rav Yehuda. Despite the procedures which had been laid out by Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, the voice of the aged authority carries the day. The student dies while still under the ban. It is this turn in the story that prompts me to consider the tendencies of institutions to cover up wrongdoing and perpetuate harm. However we judge the student and his offense, this part of the story dramatizes a failure of procedural justice as the student's appeal becomes lodged in the machinations of the rabbinic academy. This is a powerful account of what feminist scholar Sarah Ahmed has called institutional mechanics. She writes, policies and procedures might exist on paper. We can refer to them, point to them, but what happens when you try to follow them or do something with them? There is often a gap between what is supposed to happen in accordance with policy and procedure and what does happen. Though Rabbi Ami was authorized to investigate and decide, though he alone has examined the matter, the other rabbis' deference to the aged Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani and the deceased Rav Yehuda carries the day. So is the rabbinical student best understood as a perpetrator or a victim? To a large degree, the divergences between these two possible readings trace back to the relative emphases and interpreter places on disparate details of this Talmudic narrative. Lev emphasizes the vulnerability of a sorba mi rabbanan, a rabbinical student, relative to the authority of the prominent Rav Yehuda. But other details of the narrative do pull in another direction. For instance, Rav Yehuda's statement that the sages need him suggests that the sorba is no ordinary student, an impression that is reinforced later when Rav Yehuda expresses satisfaction that I am happy I did not flatter even such a man as you. Absent evidence with which to adjudicate between my initial interpretation and Sarah Lev's opposing view, I am left instead with a strong sense of indeterminacy, a muddle which evades moral clarity, raising far more questions than it answers. It leaves me wondering where in the story wrongdoing lies and what accountability would look like. I realize it is tempting to draw parallels between the moral muddle the story induces and the challenges of adjudicating allegations of sexual misconduct and abuse. Today, divergent notions of consent and the significance of power differentials make the challenge of such adjudications a flashpoint, an area of deep ideological divide. But I want to resist that reading. I want to suggest that the muddle we feel as readers is actually an effect of the storytelling, of the gaps in what we are told. What makes this Talmudic case so hard to adjudicate is precisely the problem of secrecy and silence, a problem that the Me Too movement takes on. From the beginning of the story and until the end, the students' offenses remain the stuff of rumor and innuendo, shrouded in mystery. We never hear the story of victims. The full story of the rabbinical student's offense is not known because the full story is not told, but rather suppressed like a dangerous secret. In the absence of basic information, there can be no possibility of moral clarity. And in my rush to find a piece of usable Talmud, I had unwittingly recapitulated the failures enacted within the text in my own reading. I had bowed to the authority of the text, deferring to Rabbi Yehuda and the narrator, rather than attending to the story's silences. Ultimately, the indeterminacy that this story induces is far more instructive than the moral example I initially thought I had discovered, because it trains my attention on how the storyteller colludes with the characters in keeping secrets, in suppressing the actual story of sexual misconduct. This theme of secrecy becomes explicit in the coda that immediately follows the story, where the voice of the Talmud inquires as to why the shunned student is ultimately allowed burial in the cave of Judges. What is the reason? Because he acted in accordance with Rabbi Eli, for it is taught. Rabbi Eli says, if a person sees that his impulse overcomes him, let him go to a place he is not known, wear black clothes and wrap himself in black, and let him do what his heart desires. But let him not desecrate the name of heaven in public. Bifar Hesia. Here, the Talmud banishes sexual misconduct into the shadows, insisting that it be kept under wraps. The logic of Chilul Hashem, as expressed by Rabbi Eli, directly opposes the public revelations of misdeeds by rabbis. This means that this Talmudic passage is not actually a counterweight to other rabbinic traditions that promote reticence, but very much of a piece with them. Ultimately, this Talmudic passage served as an ethical prompt in a very different way than I initially thought it would. I first turned to this text because I sought a usable tradition, a textual grounding for the principles of dignity and justice for victims that animate the Me Too movement. I seized on Rabbi Yehuda's story as a model that leaders of our own time would do well to follow, only to discover how closely it cleaves to the very patterns of domination and silencing that the Me Too movement seeks to end. This Talmudic narrative does not solve the ethical problem. It enacts it, promoting secrecy and shoring up the prestige and authority of the powerful. Studying this story does not solve the ethical conundrum, but it does bring the problems of power abuses and secrecy into sharp relief. Whether we understand the unnamed rabbinical student as perpetrator of sexual misconduct or as a victim of abuses of power, or as both, the best ethical response is not more hiding, not more secrecy, but less. So in closing, I think what I'd like to suggest is that the mistake was not Rabbi Yehuda's so much as mine. I had sifted and strained the roiling sea of Talmud in an effort to isolate that one gleaming pearl of wisdom, an authoritative source that would say exactly what I wanted it to, exactly what I had already come to believe. But this was a serious lapse, because what the Me Too movement demands is not the shoring up of old authorities, not deference to precedents from the past, but a new way of listening. Sarah Ahmed writes, to hear with a feminist ear is to hear who is not heard, how we are not heard. Since we are taught to tune out some people, a feminist ear is an achievement. So let me close with this thought. The Talmud has always been a conversation across generations. If the whispered, hidden transcripts of harassment and assault are ever to become full-throated claims for justice, and if those claims are ever to be heard and addressed, old scripts will have to be set aside as we listen to those who have not been heard, moving their stories from the margins to the center of public conversation. Let's try this. And I realize that was a lot. Let me try to stop the share so that we can talk.
Thank you very much, Mira, for this really fascinating lecture and presentation on this complicated issue. First of all, some people wrote Kol HaKavod and kudos, so thank you very much for your academic humility. Please, to all of the participants, please share your questions still. And meanwhile, we have one question from Alessandra Alio. She is writing, secrecy, silence, suppression, and complicity. The preparator is the owner of the wrongdoing, but from the victim perspective. How to repair wrongdoing and bring justice and fairness to the victim?
Wow, thank you so much for that powerful comment. I think the truth of it rings out as an ethical claim more than as a question, really. So one thing that I've learned, I'm a student of the ancient world, but one thing I've learned from activists and really from victims and survivors today is that it starts with centering on the victims and survivors. So I think there's not one answer about what justice and fairness look like. It starts with listening to victims and survivors. It starts by not questioning their accounts and really deferring to their judgment. Now, I don't want to suggest that there are no outside standards of justice. I think procedures of justice and fairness are very important. But so much of the burden of history and culture privileges so much people who have done harm and has taught us not to listen to the voices of complainants, of accusers, of victims, that we're now in the midst, I think, of a real cultural unsettling. We need to learn to hear victims and to focus on their experiences without challenging their stories. And I trust that wisdom from how to proceed will start there.
Thank you for your answer. Somebody by name Shai is asking, except of the story which you quoted of Rabbi Yehuda, do you know how many stories of which reflect Me Too we could find in Talmud?
It's a great question. You know, it's hard. I think we got very excited about this story because it seemed to be such a close match. In general, and I tried to bring this out maybe subtly, one reason that it's hard to find stories about Me Too reflected in the Talmud is because to the degree that Me Too is a movement for the empowerment of women, there's not a lot of women's voices within the Talmud. There are some, and I think there's inspirations in stories like the story of Broria, who talks back to rabbis. Now, there's lots of stories about Broria, a learned woman of her time. Sometimes she's given the last word, but sometimes she's not. So I think it's difficult to find. We do see Talmudic rabbis struggling with abuses of power. So if we think not in terms of gender, but in terms of institutional power, then we could find other precedents. I think ultimately what I was trying to suggest today is that because of the way that the voices that the Talmudic storytelling focuses on are so often aligned with structures of power, that we really need to look beyond our texts and hold up other experiences and other voices if we're truly to grapple with the challenge of Me Too in our time.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Actually, we don't have any more written questions. If somebody would like to ask anything more, please raise your hand, and I can unmute you. Or you can also write a short message on in a chat, and I will also unmute you, because I think there is some issue with a list of attendees. I see only few people, but I see that also that the total number is much higher. So there is some bug today, I think, in the chat. So if anyone would like to ask, please raise your hand or write a short note in our chat.
While we're waiting to see if anyone else responds, I'm thinking about Shai's question, which is very good. And there's one more thing that I would say, which is I think it is the case that people often invoke teachings about Lashon Hara, assuming that we can't talk about accusations and perpetrators. But I think actually, if you delve into traditional writings about Lashon Hara, there's a lot more latitude for speaking out against wrongdoing, especially when speaking out is going to prevent harm. So I think this notion that secret keeping is what Lashon Hara teaches us, teachings about Lashon Hara teaches us, is a misreading of the tradition. And in that sense, I think there is strong support for some of the values of Me Too in traditional Jewish speech ethics.
Great, lovely, great additional comment. Okay, many people are writing thank you. Thank you, Mira, for wonderful lecture. And we hope to host you again in the future. And good luck with your further research.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be with you all. And happy Purim.
Happy Purim to all of you.
Thanks so much.
Greetings from Jerusalem. Bye.